that they can no longer take for granted the 3 to 7% annual growth in gross domestic product that has been assumed to be normal throughout recent history. In fact, the energy picture, the dwindling of a particular extraordinary one-time special resource, oil, implies a general contraction of productive activity. And our expectations for growth are vested in tradable paper certificates like currencies, stocks, bonds, and other instruments that represent our confidence that society will produce more wealth. And the idea that this increase can be enjoyed in the form of profits and dividends. And what happens when that consensus about our expectations falls apart and we no longer believe that these certificates will produce 3 to 7% of growth in wealth a year for us? So we can see the beginning of this process right now in the unwinding of the home mortgage sector. This recent experiment in the abolition of moral hazard, in the suspension of norms and standards in lending, in the fobbing off of risk, is climaxing in one of the great debacles of modern economics. It was based on the idea that immense numbers of promises for future payment could be bundled into bonds, resold, and parlayed to leverage ever more abstract casino-like bets masquerading as investments. This is anything but investment in future productive activity. It is now being discovered that at the foundation of all this jive finance lies bundles of broken promises, non-performing loans, as they're called. And it remains to be seen how this mortgage and housing fiasco will play out. But I think it will be one of the major events leading to an overall loss of presumed wealth for American society. And it is likely to infect global finance as well. The key to all our everyday activities in the future is scale. We're probably going to have to live more locally than has been the case. And I think we can state categorically that things organized at the giant scale, whether they're corporations or universities or chains of stores or schools or governments, are going to run into trouble. School is another thing we're going to have trouble with. The giant centralized school districts that were all super organized in the last 30 years in order to save administrative costs, that are served by the gigantic fleets of yellow school buses collecting all the pupils from the 50-mile pupil sheds. We built the same flat-roofed one-story buildings in Florida and Minnesota, and we're going to discover that they're hard to heat without cheap natural gas. And we're going to have to do something about that. What we're going to do, we have no idea. My guess is that the remedy for this is going to be a self-organizing process growing out of the homeschooling movement as it aggregates into larger units. The destiny of higher education, of course, is another troubling thing. The gigantic universities are exactly the kinds of institutions that are going to prove unwieldy and unsupportable in the long emergency. College will cease to be a mass consumer activity, and it may become, if it survives at all, an activity for a much smaller economic elite. And, of course, it will generate resentment and grievance because of this. The question of class relations, per se, will be affected by our energy situation, since it is necessarily linked to the economy. The long emergency is going to produce a lot of economic losers, a group I call the formerly middle class. They will lose jobs, they will lose incomes, and they will never get them back. They're going to be full of grievance and anger and resentment and bewilderment at the loss of their entitlements to the non-negotiable American way of life, including home ownership and affordable, happy motoring. And they're liable to express their unease and unhappiness politically. We'll be lucky if they do not turn to demagogues who promise to mount some sort of campaign or another to restore the entitlements of suburban life. And such a campaign will be an enormous exercise in futility and a gross waste of our remaining resources. We, I think, can be secure in understanding that our cities are probably going to contract. Giant cities of the late 20th, early 21st century are products of a cheap oil economy. We are not going to be able to operate them at the scale that they're at now. The ones that are composed of suburban fabric are going to be the ones that get in the most trouble. And some of them are going to have, like Phoenix, will have additional problems with water and producing food locally on top of energy problems. The good news is in Las Vegas, the excitement will be over. For the past 2 decades, I've been associated with the New Urbanist movement, and the New Urbanists were architects, planners, and developers who recognized the tremendous liabilities and weaknesses of the suburban development pattern, and they've been campaigning to reform the way we build things in this country for 15 years. Their methods are consistent with what we're going to need in the decades to come, to refashion human habitats that have a future. The great achievements of the New Urbanists was not in the new projects and new towns that they built, not the seasides that have been built. Their great achievement was to retrieve lost knowledge from the dumpster of history, a whole body of principle and knowledge and methodology and skill necessary to design places worth living in. And this was the knowledge we threw away, we threw in the garbage in 1950 in order to become a drive-in utopia. We threw it away thinking that true urban design and artistry could be replaced with statistical analysis and traffic engineering. Big mistake. And what we managed to do was build a land full of scary places that turned us into a nation of scary people. But this was the final tragedy of suburbia. We put up thousands of places that aren't worth caring about, not understanding that when we had enough of them, that we might be left with a nation that was not worth defending. So there you have a comprehensive to-do list of the things that we have to do, the challenges that we have to meet in this what will be a permanent global oil crisis. Growing our own food locally, restoring our railroads and other forms of public transit, rebuilding local networks of commerce and economic interdependency, reorganizing education, and building places that are worth living in. We cannot assume a seamless transition between where we are at now and where we're going. In fact, it's more liable to be turbulent and disorderly. We can't assume that technology alone will rescue us. In fact, one of the big delusions in the media, especially today, but generally in the American public at large, is that technology and energy are the same thing, and that if you run out of one, you just plug in the other. Technology and energy are different. They're not the same thing, and they are not interchangeable. When I go around to colleges, I'm always asked at the end of my talks, can you please give us some hope? Because the college kids find this a discouraging picture of where they're going to spend most of their lives. And I have to tell them, I cannot give you hope. Hope is something that we have to supply for ourselves. We are the generators of hope, especially the young people are the generators of hope. And they generate the hope by demonstrating to themselves that they're capable, that they're competent, that they are realistic and brave enough to greet the circumstances that reality is sending our way. And then by demonstrating that they're capable of accomplishing the things necessary to meet those challenges. That's how we develop hope. We develop hope by developing confidence in our ability, not by being passive, not by wishing, not by expecting to get something for nothing, which has been the pattern of the broad American public imagination for the last several decades, but by developing true skills and true courage in the face of what reality is really sending to